Hello everyone. Today I want to cover some of the controversies surrounding Thomas Jefferson. There is a lot to talk about. I don't want to waste a lot of time in an introduction. Jefferson is a super controversial character, so there's a lot to talk about, all right? And let's get started. All right, so we're gonna watch this video called "What Makes Thomas Jefferson So Controversial," and it's by the channel TED Ed, and it's from the same series that it's History versus. And I already made a video on History versus Columbus, so now I want to do History versus Jefferson, and let's just get started.
He was part of America's fight for freedom and equality, but were his enlightened principles outweighed by participation in a greater injustice? Find out on History versus Thomas Jefferson. Order, order. Hey, that's one of the guys from Mount Rushmore. No, this is Thomas Jefferson, founding father of the United States of America and primary author of the Declaration of Independence, the document that established the U.S. as a democratic republic on the principle that everyone is created equal. If by everyone you mean property-owning white men, at the time Jefferson was writing, 1/5 of the colony's population was enslaved. Surely he couldn't be expected to single-handedly overturn the institution of slavery, couldn't he?
And very significantly is not only that he can't single-handedly overturn the institution of slavery, is that the standard of the time, if you put some historical context of it, is that, the world, the leading nations in the world, if you mention Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, slavery existed in all of these nations, right? Um, so I don't know. I mean, to judge Jefferson based on modern ideas, on modern interpretations of what is equality, on modern interpretations of this very important thing that recall historical context, I think it's incorrect, right?
Just written that into the Declaration? It wasn't that simple, Your Honor. Jefferson was one of 5 authors, and the document had to be ratified by the Continental Congress. He included a clause opposing the slave trade, but state delegates removed it. Nevertheless, Jefferson recognized slavery as an immoral institution and condemned it throughout his life. But Jefferson.
And very significantly, the Jefferson does initially write some criticism on slavery. He does not agree with it. However, the controversial part of Jefferson is that although he's criticizing it a lot, he still is the slave owner, right? And what is happening here also is that Jefferson wants to start the country without slavery. However, the southern colonies will not be willing to sign the Declaration of Independence if you remove slavery, you know, from their economy, right? So it's not that Jefferson doesn't want it, but is that the southern states will not ratify it if you include this part about slavery.
Never came close to matching his actions. As Virginia's governor, he did nothing to change the state's slave laws, and in his personal life, he held over 600 people in slavery. Furthermore, he believed black people were intellectual inferiors who, if emancipated, should return to their countries of origin. Frankly, there's no argument that Jefferson did anything significant to combat slavery.
I mean, I have a major pushback on this, and it's the fact that n- there's two big things that Jefferson does, right? And you could make the argument that before Lincoln, Jefferson is the president that actually does the most to combat slavery. And the first one is that he passes this ban on the transatlantic slave trade, right? I think it's 1807 or 1808, right? But he's the only president that actually does something about the issue of slavery. Kind of weird, kind of like strange in the sense that he's a slave owner, but he's also the president that actually does the most before Lincoln. The other thing that Washington does, not Washington, sorry, Jefferson does, is this idea of the Northwest Ordinance. this requirement for the northern states as they expand west, this requirement for the new states to abolish slavery, that idea is from Jefferson, right? Jefferson is the one that is kind of like pushing for the idea that in the north, the northern states as they expand west, they should be banning slavery, either be it gradual, be it immediate, in any sense. The idea is that they should start without slavery, and this idea is from Jefferson, right? So the fact that he says that he does nothing to combat slavery, it's kind of weird, to be honest.
It's true, Your Honor, but Jefferson did make important contributions to religious, financial, and gender equality. He led the charge for separating church and state, removing government funding for Virginia's Anglican Church, and paving the way for our modern understanding of religious freedom. Jefferson also drafted laws that weakened the power of inherited wealth and pushed for the state funded education of boys and girls. All that.
And by the way, just to make a little note, this idea that we understand separation of separation of church and state today is different. The way we understand it today, as it was initially intended, uh, the way we see it is in the Jefferson's idea of how it's supposed to be, but it's not the way we intended it to be, right? So, I mean, this is a longer topic, right? But just just to make a little note.
Reforms, but you're avoiding the fundamental issue here. None of this benefited enslaved people or indigenous Americans, and it's ridiculous to argue that Jefferson was pursuing equality when his policies frequently harmed non white groups. Policy.
Okay, I have two big issues with this, right? And this may be a little bit long. Okay, one is that Jefferson is a man of his time, right? And this is very, very, very important, right? Historical context is very important, right? Jefferson is a man that, yes, he's not an advocate for ending slavery, and he's not an advocate for equality between Indians or between, enslaved people, but that is the standard of the time during Jefferson's life, right? Again, what are the leading nations of the world doing at the time, right? And if I'm not mistaken, Britain is not gonna abolish slavery until 1833, and France in the 1850s. So to expect Jefferson to be a man of the to have the same values as the present, it's a crazy concept, right? To make that criticism of him and say that he is not a good person because he doesn't hold the moral values that we have today, right? Well, he's not a man of today, right? He's a man of the late 1700s and early 1800s, in which his standard of the time, it's, he's not very different from the standard of the time, right? It's not like he's the only person that believes these things. It's actually he's for the time, he's incredibly progressive in some ways, not in everything, but in some ways, he's very progressive, as an enlightened man, right? So that's my first point. The second point, and this is a bigger thing, right? But I feel that this modern interpretation of history revolves way too much around race and slavery. All right. So what I mean to say is that in today's interpretation of history, this modern interpretation of history, we tend to judge people based on what did these people think about slavery, and we tend to disregard everything else, right? So in the case of Washington or Jefferson, right, they may have been the first president, the author of the Declaration of Independence, or Madison, right, the author of the Constitution, right, or the father of the Constitution, right? But if they dared have slaves, right, we tend to disregard everything else and demonize these people because of their views on slavery, right? So we tend to judge people entirely, or not entirely, but in great part, based on what were their views on slavery, right? And if they don't have the views of the present, then they are bad people. Then they should be judged, in a different manner, right? So I find it a little bit strange that today we have this obsession with race and slavery, right? And we tend to expect people of the past to have the morals of the present, right? Which is a huge mistake. But you know, this is not just using presentism, right? Judging the events of the past with the eyes of the present, right? But it's this idea on not only that, but exclusively or not exclusive, right? But in large part on slavery, right? What were their views on slavery? And if they're good, in if they match our views on the present, then they're good people. And if they don't, then they're bad people, right? And it's a little strange, to be honest, right? That we have this, I see it with a lot of people, this obsession with, what were their views on this very specific topic, right? And I don't know, I just find it to be incorrect, right? That we have this obsession with this topic in particular. Okay. But anyways.
such as authorizing the military to exterminate indigenous communities during the Revolutionary War. Objection. Those Northwestern tribes were allied with the British. In peacetime, Jefferson did his best to avoid conflict with Native Americans and believed they could be equal to whites. Could be equal? Listen to yourself. Are you defending his attempts to forcibly assimilate indigenous communities? Jefferson's recommendations even formed the basis for the Indian Removal Act years later.
And again, this goes back to the standard of the time, right? For the standard of the time, for Jefferson to recognize that, Indians could be, you know, part of American society, it's incredible. It's incredibly progressive, right? This is what I meant earlier by in some things he's very progressive, right? For example, this one. Okay, I know today it may sound like, oh, I mean that's incorrect, right? But this is the early 1800s, okay? And just to put it into context, the standard of the time, if you think about the British have a relocation policy. The British were not in any way, shape, or form willing to assimilate Indians into the British society, right? They were, fine with coexisting separately, but not integrating or assimilating to the British culture, right? So this idea that we should welcome Indians into our society, it's pretty progressive for the time, right? So this is what I mean by this, you know, presentism and obsession with, race. Okay, and I see that this video revolves a lot around that.
Recommendations, why not laws? Thomas Jefferson served as a diplomat and Secretary of State before being elected as Vice President under John Adams in 1796, a role in which he undermined the president's authority. Jefferson argued that states should have the power to overrule federal laws they deemed unconstitutional, an argument some southern states would cite while seceding from the Union 70 years later. I think it's a little unreasonable to lay the entire Civil War at Jefferson's feet. Besides, his
Yeah, this is a little bit crazy to try to put secession on Jefferson. Although I will mention this idea of states' rights, it's largely a very Jeffersonian vision. The states' rights, individual rights. It'll be interesting to, as a thought experiment, what would Jefferson think about secession, right? If states wanted to nullify federal laws, he was a proponent of that, right? But I don't know if he would have agreed with secession per se, right? But anyways,
of states' rights was motivated by the president's overreaching central government. As part of Adams' preparations for war with France, he signed legislation that tightened restrictions on immigrants and limited criticism of the government. Jefferson was just trying to protect the public, and ultimately, his efforts were so popular that he was elected as the next president. A dubious victory. He only won because states were allowed to count enslaved people towards their population without giving them voting rights. This system gave states that held people in slavery additional voting power in the Electoral College until the Civil War. Be that
I mean, I think this is also a ridiculous statement, right? Suggesting that any president, any Southern president that won the election, until the end of the Civil War, won it in a dubious manner, right? the vast majority of presidents in the U.S. before the Civil War are actually Southerners, right? Just think about four of the first five are from Virginia, right? But to say it's dubious, I mean, he's specifically talking about the Thrift Compromise, right? But I don't think it puts any dent on the way they want it to be considered dubious, right? But I don't like the way the video is presenting the both of the sides, right? But
As it may, Jefferson was a popular president. He worked to prevent the country from taking on too much debt and successfully led the U.S. through the Napoleonic and the Barbary Wars. Plus, he dramatically expanded the country's territory through the Louisiana Purchase, where he once again failed to stop slavery from taking hold.
yeah, this is again what I mentioned earlier. This expansion of the northern states, everything you see in blue, or not everything, but most of what you see here, you know, um, west of the Mississippi River in blue, I mean, it was mostly settled through something called the Northwest Ordinance, and they require that you abolish slavery. Again, be it gradual or immediate, but that's a Jefferson idea. Okay, and you know, yeah, he's not doing anything to abolish slavery in large part because presidents don't have that power. And I'm incredibly, not concerned, but it calls my attention that he keeps saying that Jefferson does nothing to abolish slavery, but presidents don't have that power. If presidents had the power to abolish slavery, possibly John Adams would have abolished slavery, right? He's a big abolitionist, and so is his son Quincy Adams. They would have, but they just don't have that power, right? Congress itself could have the power if you have the majority, but no one does, and the Supreme Court doesn't have that power, right? It's only through a constitutional amendment or through getting, a big majority in Congress, right? But otherwise, presidents don't have that authority. So I'm not sure what he's expecting Jefferson to do to abolish slavery. He just doesn't have that power. No president have that power. Lincoln is gonna abolish slavery through a constitutional amendment in the middle of the Civil War, right? And it's kind of like this, big victory of Lincoln, but he's doing it through the Civil War, right? Not just a I became president and I'm gonna abolish slavery, right? So I don't know. It seems like he's asking way too much out of Jefferson. I don't think that he doesn't even have the power to do it.
I'll remind you that President Jefferson signed a law forbidding the importation of enslaved people in 1807, and yet he continued to enslave those already on American soil,
Yeah,
including.
this is what I meant earlier when I said that he banned the transatlantic slave trade, right? So now he's bringing it up, but in a few minutes earlier he said he did nothing to combat slavery.
Own flesh and blood. Pardon? Following his wife's death, Jefferson began a relationship with her half sister and maid, Sally Hemings. Jefferson fathered 6 children with Hemings and kept the entire relationship secret while continuing to publicly denounce the personhood of Black Americans. Jefferson freed several members of the Hemings family, including his children with Sally, while refusing to free anyone else. Despite.
Yeah, this is the most controversial part of Jefferson, and yeah, this is a huge dent on him, right? The idea that he maintained his relationship with Sally Hemings a secret. They had children, he freed them, but you know it is the most controversial thing on Jefferson. This whole thing with Sally Hemings. As you can imagine, I'm a I'm a big fan of Jefferson. And even for me, it's kind of hard to kind of defend this thing, right? Not even for the standard of time, right? Not even for the standard of the time you could justify this thing.
Enslaving over 600 people, Jefferson only freed 10, 5 during his life and 5 in his will, all members of the Hemings family.
I will tell you this: expect him to free his slaves. It's kind of like I don't know why you would expect it. It's not something that people would do in the past, right? So I mean, again, I feel like they're putting all this unrealistic expectation on Jefferson, and they put it on Washington too. And even with Washington, they criticize him because he only freed the slaves after he died and after Martha died, right? That's the only time when you free the slaves. And even then, he's criticized for this, right? But again, it's not like people were freeing the slaves and they're the only ones who are not. Okay, so the standard of the time was that people didn't free the slaves, right? So it it did become a little bit popular after the American Revolution, manumitting slaves, but it's not like a widespread thing that a lot of people are doing, particularly people like Washington, Jefferson that owned a whole bunch of slaves.
Now, I have to admit, this seems indefensible. It's true, Your Honor. Despite pursuing what he believed to be equality, Jefferson failed to uphold his own ideals. Ultimately, he was a man of his time, living in an economy that relied on exploitation and enslaved labor. That's hardly a defense when many of Jefferson's contemporaries opposed slavery and took action to abolish it. Even
Now, I'm assuming this is William Lloyd Garrison and this could be Frederick Douglass. This I wouldn't consider these people to be Jefferson contemporaries. Jefferson, he was president in the early 1800s, um, from 1800 to 1808, and William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist movement as we know it today, the one that wants equality, aside from freedom, it's something that happens until the 1830s and 40s, right? So it's a few generations removed, right? I wouldn't call them contemporary per se. Contemporaries of Jefferson would be someone like John Adams, Franklin. They would be, you know, abolitionists. Uh, for the standard of the time, they were abolitionists, but in today's, for the 1850s, they would be considered anti-slavery. But you know, I mean, there are some people, but I wouldn't say like everyone was like this or most of the founding fathers. It's actually very few of the founding fathers. Okay, so this criticism towards Jefferson, I think it's incorrect.
some people considered him a great man in his time, he doesn't have to be an icon in ours. Well, I hear Mount Rushmore has a problematic past, too. Can we judge historical figures by modern standards? And what responsibilities do powerful people have to the future? Answering these questions is all part of putting history on trial.
Yeah, this idea of can we judge the people of the past with, with the eyes of the present, it's a very simple answer, and it's no, right? So I feel like the video does not do a good job at giving it the proper context over everything, at being unbiased, and it's a very similar criticism that I get to the Columbus video. And I think it's part of this whole modern thing of reinterpreting everything in history based on their views on slavery and giving it a large importance on whether they were ahead of their time on slavery or were they the standard of the time on slavery, and based on that we see them as good people or bad people or bad people. But this is pretty modern, to be honest, right? This new idea that you know their views on slavery take a center stage on how we judge people. Because if you notice, the video doesn't criticize other things on Jefferson. And I'm a big fan of Jefferson. There are other things to criticize about Jefferson, right? He was a manipulator. He was a horrible vice president to John Adams, who he undermined largely to his benefit. He and the video very briefly mentioned this, right? uh, you know, he is, one of the responsible for the rise of political parties. There's a lot of very fair criticism to make about Jefferson. but the criticism usually comes to what were his views on slavery. And I think it's unfair. I think it's an unfair judgment of people the 1700s, 1800s, to expect them to hold the same moral values that we do today, right? So again, there's plenty to criticize from about Jefferson, right? And particularly the views on slavery, I would criticize the whole Sally Hemings thing, right? But you know, the whole everything else, the whole that he was a slave owner, that he did free slaves. Um, I feel like you know you're you're expecting Jefferson to be a man of the future, and he's a man of his time, and so I feel it's kind of unfair. And this video series on TED when they judge people they or historical figures they tend to have this bias towards this very modern interpretation uh, on history, right? They lack a lot of or not they like they use a lot of presentism to judge people, right? But anyways, let me know what you think about Jefferson. Do you agree with me in my interpretation, or do you think the video was fair? You know, I'll be open to hear different opinions, and this will have real. Okay, see you guys. Be safe.